Signalis is, without a doubt, a true return to survival horror.
Signalis is a masterstroke in survival horror. Elden Ring and Dad of War are going to dominate discussions for Game of the Year. I hope Signalis gets its due in these discussions, as it's earned it.
Signalis is the most recent triumph of the indie game horror community, a labor of love created primarily by two people, and it might just be one of the greatest horror games ever made. That may sound like a bold claim, but I truly believe it.
Two of the most striking I've played are the much beloved Nier Automata and the far less known but equally captivating Signalis. Both games are masterpieces, albeit in very different ways.
Signalis is in my top 3 games of 2022 behind Elden Ring and God of War, and it might actually beat Elden Ring. I haven't quite decided yet.
Signalis is fucking excellent, and hands down one of the best and most affecting games I've played this year.
I can't stop playing Signalis. At the moment of writing this, I've played the game 5 times.
Signalis is one of the best games I played to come out in recent years.
Signalis is a masterpiece of a survival horror game.
Overwhelmingly positive.
Whenever I decide to cover any topic or media on this channel, it's either because it's one that I don't see very many people talking about, or it's because I believe I have something new to say or a different perspective to give for it that I don't see from many others. My first review ever was on Ace Combat 7, and that was because the coverage of the game I was seeing at the time was mostly being made by veterans and longtime fans of the series as opposed to newcomers like me. I wasn't seeing the game talked about much outside of the already established fan circle of the series, so I thought that my perspective as a newcomer could bring something fresh to the table. I even called myself a nugget in the title to emphasize my inexperience, since it's a word used by the Ace Combat community to refer to newcomers. You can see the same logic behind my Halo CE review and its title as well, since I made that video for the same reasons as my Ace Combat one, to cover an already legendary series that has been talked to death a million times already, but from a newcomer's perspective for a change. On the other hand, I made the endoparasitic and BPM videos more because I wasn't seeing them talked about much in general. People were uploading clips and playthroughs of the games or streaming them, but there weren't any review videos I was seeing besides some occasional 5-minute recommendations, so I decided to change that for those two. But why am I saying all of these now after showing you a montage of countless people already praising Signalis, with some of them probably being ones you are familiar with or even follow if you are watching a channel like mine? It's clear that while it may not be among the most popular titles out there, Signalis is not something that completely flew under the radar and remained in obscurity. It has been, currently is, and will likely be talked about in an endless sea of video essays, articles, Reddit posts and much more for quite a while. It still keeps being discovered by new players and staring at others from its place in their endless backlogs, and I guarantee that most of these new players will also hold similar sentiments to the ones I showed at the beginning. So then, is it because I have something new to say about the game that I haven't seen anyone else say? Have I made a new discovery or found myself having a different perspective on this game than everyone else? Well, no, that's not the case either. I'm not here to talk about this game because of the usual reasons. I'm here because I can't stop thinking about it and need to gush about it. Everyone has already sung the highest praises for it and analyzed everything about it to death, and now I'm here a whole year late to the party, only to reaffirm their statements by parroting them, to say that, yeah, the game is phenomenal, and it's a crime against humanity that it was not nominated for a single category in the 2022 Game Awards. Signalis is everything you've heard people say it is, and more. It is peak sci-fi horror, Lovecraftian horror, body horror, and psychological horror at the same time. It is about the beauty of love and its unrelenting perseverance as much as it is about the hopeless futility of those struggles. It is about trauma, oppression, never-ending nightmares, shattered memories, and shattered personalities. It is remarkably bleak yet so captivating that you'll find yourself trying to navigate each and every corner of that darkness, trying to find more, following every single clue in its symbolism and cryptic storytelling to piece together a cohesive narrative, only to drive yourself insane at the end with perhaps even more questions. It is a perfect homage to the PS1 era survival horror games like classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill, while also crafting its own unique identity despite the countless inspirations it wears proudly on its sleeve. It is a masterpiece that I went into with very high expectations because of everyone I I know on the internet and their grandmas praising it to the highest degrees, and it still blew me away at the end. Some of you, a lot of you even, may still not be convinced to try the game out for yourselves even after all this rambling and these buzzwords flying around. Maybe classic survival horror is not your jam, or the game's art style turns you off or something, and those are all valid reasons. Whether we enjoy a piece of work or not is just as much about personal taste as the quality of said work most of the time, if not more, and I definitely think that Signalis is not a game for everyone. Even for me, a few aspects of its gameplay made me question if it followed perhaps too closely in the footsteps of its inspirations for its own good at times. Before I get to that though, I want to quickly go over the rest of its gameplay first, which is all fantastic. Shockingly, I actually don't have too much of an issue with the 6-slot inventory, even though it's probably what I've seen about the game criticized the most. It is brought up as an unnecessarily brutal part of the gameplay by some out there, especially with a couple of items needing to be on your person at all times. I get where they're coming from, and I think that it would be brutal if the safe rooms and thus the item boxes were not placed so perfectly in relation to each other. If these rooms were further apart from each other and or you didn't unlock shortcuts between them, then yes, the 6-slot inventory could go fuck itself. But as they are, I didn't mind having to go through some of the rooms 2 or 3 times to get everything in them, or having to go back to the nearest safe room after clearing a room of enemies to restock. You already end up going back and forth between all the rooms frequently for puzzles and key items anyway. In fact, the game doubling down on all this back and forth with the restrictive inventory makes some of its other gameplay elements shine even more, I'd say, most notably with the decision making process of how to deal with each enemy. It pushes the player further to think carefully on whether or not they want to waste ammo on an enemy, and if they do, whether or not they should use one of their precious termites or flare rounds to permanently get rid of them. So overall, I'd actually count the inventory space as one of the many fine-tuned aspects of the overall gameplay loop that make it so fantastic overall as a result. To list the others, the puzzle variety is great and always keeps things fresh, especially coupled with the radio mechanic and how that is used in different ways to solve puzzles dependent on it. Enemy and weapon variety, along with the pace at which they are introduced one by one, is also fantastic. The amount of resources you get and how they are scattered around feels perfect as well, maybe with just the exception of healing items. Not only have I pretty much never struggled with finding enough of them, but I almost always had excess amounts in my item box that I could rely on if I had to. It felt as if they were tuned for a difficulty below what I was playing on, unlike the rest of the resources, so maybe some tweaking could be done there. Still, it didn't take away much from the experience thanks to the limited inventory space and 3 being the upper carrying limit for items of the same type. Even if I had excess healing items, I had to keep them stored in the item box and not on my person most of the time, so it didn't end up giving me too unfair of an advantage overall. Then there's the camera, movement and aiming controls, which all feel perfect. They're in the same vein as those isometric pixelated indie action Metroidvanias like Hyper Light Drifter and Unsighted, where the camera moves with your character while your mouse controls where they are looking and thus aiming at. I quite like this system, and the simple UI elements in Signalis that come up when you aim is a great addition for its combat. It puts these red squares on your enemies that get smaller and smaller as you keep aiming at the same one, which means that your shot will be more accurate and thus more devastating. There are also these red crosses that appear inside the squares to indicate whether your shot will actually hit the enemy you are aiming at or not, since they can be behind a wall or their shield could be up. I think this was a great choice for this game instead of sticking to the same type of camera angles and aiming of the classic survival horror titles. The mechanics, environments, visual style, gameplay loop and so much more is already there to scratch that nostalgia itch for those games as fans, while the modern camera and control scheme makes it approachable for new players like me who have no prior experience with those titles. It makes the game still feel like a classic without it feeling outdated, if you will. You have also several different options on whether you want to make things more automatic or manual for yourself. For instance, there is actually an option to turn on tank controls if you are one of those classic survival horror veterans and want to have that old school control scheme. I didn't choose that of course cause I'm not a psycho, but what I did choose despite my modern gamerness was to keep auto reloading off, which meant that my character would not reload an empty clip by her own volition without my input. I chose it to be this way since I wanted to add an extra thing to keep track of for myself, thinking that it could add an extra thin layer of challenge that could make things more engaging. And you know what? That's exactly what it did, so I'm happy I kept this option off. I had several moments where I entered a room trying to blast through the enemies inside right away, only to realize I had forgotten to reload after the last one and shat myself in panic as my character took a couple of hits because of my carelessness. Yet another Another option in the same vein as these is choosing whether or not your character automatically equips stun prods, which are these disposable melee weapons that you can use to instantly get rid of an enemy at close range. They're like the disposable knives in the newer Resident Evil games but more busted, and are thus instantly consumed on use instead of losing durability. These prods count as equipment, and your character can have one weapon and one piece of equipment equipped at once. So as you may guess, the option makes it so that if you have no equipment equipped on you, any stun prod you pick up is automatically equipped, which is great. So why is it just for the stun prods? This is where I get into the very few gripes I have with the gameplay that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. To lump them into one general bullet point, it's the way that your weapon and equipment is handled overall that I just cannot get behind. First off, let me begin by repeating that question. Why is this option just for stun prods? In what world would I not want to equip the first equipable item I find if I have nothing equipped in that slot? You may say it adds yet another layer of challenge to the game that way, like manual reloading does, and yeah, I don't disagree with that. There were times when I did not realize until mid-combat that I had forgotten to equip something and it made me take a hit as a result. Same type of consequences for carelessness as with the manual reloading there. That's fine. I'm just so utterly confused as to why my two options are either equip everything manually or equip only the stun prod automatically and everything else still manually. I can just find no sensible reason behind why it would be implemented like this instead of just all automatic or all manual. And if you want to make it customizable for specific items, then why not do it for each item rather than just a stun prod? But the much bigger problem I have with weapons and equipment is how you switch between them, or rather how you don't. There's no on-the-fly weapon or equipment switching when the limited inventory system would actually be a perfect fit for it. Rather than having a hotkey each for cycling between weapons and between equipment, you could simply have the whole inventory accessible via a 6-slot hotbar. Yes, the radio controls in this game occupy the hotkeys that would normally be for your hotbar, but you have only 2 of those in the first place, so you can easily carry them somewhere else even if they end up somewhere a little more inconvenient. You don't really need to be so quick and precise with the radio controls anywhere in the game anyway, and yes, that does include those radiohead enemies because they're incredibly forgiving pushovers compared to every other enemy. Plus, a hotbar would also eliminate the need for a specific hotkey to use equipment as well, since those items could then be targeted and used via the same hotkeys as the weapons. I promise you that I'm not bitching about this just because I want every combat system in the world to have on-the-fly weapon switching like Devil May Cry or something. I actually think that having to go through your inventory like this fits what Signalis is going for far more, but the issue is that the inventory pauses the game. Look, if you're going to make me open up my inventory and scroll to the weapon to switch to it in the year 2022, then you should at least make that slow switch mean something. Endoparasitic did this fantastically, where having to perform each action through your inventory screen so slowly does not create more tedium but rather more engagement with the combat, as trying to frantically reload everything and heal while the enemies keep closing in on you improves the whole experience. If opening up the inventory did not pause the game and the enemies kept creeping towards me in Signalis as well, then I would have no problems with having to do everything that way, as it would be adding so much more tension and challenge to the game during the combat. Instead, when it pauses the game, it means that I am actually switching weapons on the fly, but it only seems that way from the enemy's perspective while I still have to go through a menu myself. It doesn't just kill the pace of the encounter and waste my time, but it also means that I can exploit several subsystems of the game tied to its combat as well. Reloading has an animation as you would expect, and so does healing with the auto injector if it's in your equipment slot and you use it via the hotkey. Why did I specify that last part? Well, it's because you can use healing items and reload your weapons through the inventory screen, which pauses the game. Why should I press the reload hotkey during combat and try to avoid enemies until my animation finishes when I could just as easily open the inventory and reload my weapon there without any consequences? This especially hurts the game so much because it otherwise creates tension in its encounters so well with its impeccable atmosphere and sound design. The enemy's screams when you are detected are blood-curdling, their movements are creepy and frantic, and the soundtrack is panic-inducing. But it all falls apart when you realize you can effectively zawardo them anytime you want for as long as you want, so that you can swap your weapons and your equipment, heal yourself and reload your weapons, all without having to worry about any of them rushing you while you sort out your stuff. I can name so many games where this would not be as big of an issue, and yet they still know better than to make their inventory screens pause the game. If you are being chased by a monster in Minecraft at half a heart, you can't just open up your inventory right then and there, heal yourself to full health immediately, and then carry on as usual. You have to run away so you can find a safe space where you can open up your inventory and heal yourself. In Subnautica, if you are being chased by a Leviathan at less than half HP, you can't just leisurely hover over the medkit before you use it and then casually swap out your propulsion cannon for the stasis rifle in the inventory screen while the beast is suspended in stop time. You have to be as quick as possible to not fuck up, and this urgency creates the most horrifying and tense moments when coupled with the loud roars of the Leviathan. When you can pause time in a game for just your enemy and do stuff in that pause time, no matter how minor, that's essentially a superpower, one that should not belong in a survival game, let alone a survival horror game. These games understand that pausing must go both ways. That's why regular ass pause menus exist in the first place. Signalis has one as well that is separate from the inventory, so it has no excuse. At the very least, there should be an option to turn the inventory pause off, as I believe that's the only significant problem with the game, not its 6-slot inventory or anything else. I'm sorry that I've harped on the game for this one thing so much. I promise that my statements at the beginning still stand, and I still absolutely adore this game to death overall. It's just kind of frustrating when it has such a glaring oversight like this while everything else feels perfect. It makes this one small issue I have with the game stick out like the sorest of all thumbs when I love everything else so much. I can accept doing everything through an inventory screen that pauses the game if it's an old title like RE4 or something, but Signalis came out in 2022 with this little part of it unfortunately stuck in 2000 for the worse and not the better. I respect the game's commitment to the classic survival horror conventions, but this was one it should have either ditched or innovated on rather than leave it as is. Thankfully, this is only one of the many areas in which the game shows full commitment to its way of doing things, and it's the only one that does not work while all the others enhance the experience for the intended audience. The game takes so many risks with its design rather than trying to be for everyone, and the results of this speak for themselves with the cult following it's amassed. Games that try to cater to everyone's interests and play it safe can usually end up being liked by many people, but they seldom come to hold a truly special place for any of their players at the end. There are exceptions to this rule of course, but they're few and far between in the endless sea of corporate AAA sludge that often goes for this approach. Rose Engine's design philosophy on the other hand, like that of many of the best indie games out there, was clearly the exact opposite of this. That's why I said at the beginning of this section that Signalis is probably not a game for everyone despite being a masterpiece. I've already touched on the reasons of this concerning the visual style and gameplay, so now let me talk about the rest of the game's risky commitments, mainly to its story and to how it's told. I usually prefer stories that are told in a conventional way. Let me see the events unfold as they are before my very eyes. Show me what's happening clearly in a chronological order without being cryptic. I'm fine with having to put in a little effort in order to get the deeper meaning or message in a story, but I usually don't care much for piecing together a giant puzzle of lore pieces together to even reach a cohesive narrative before I can begin to analyze it. When I played Inscription, for instance, I was satisfied enough with understanding the motivations of the characters and the basics of the plot. I didn't care too much for whatever the old data was or any of the meta-narratives surrounding that plot, and I still don't really care to this day. And by that same logic, I should have also not cared so much for the plot of Signalis, as it tells its story through symbolism, environmental clues, notes lying around, flashbacks in random order, lines of dialogue with vague reasonings or motivations behind them, and subplots that seem disconnected from each other on a surface level. It is left up to the player to connect the dots from start to finish, as the game never makes a compromise against its commitment to tell its story this way. There is no grand expository reveal at any point. Even in the final act where the most important clues are dropped, they're still sprinkled around for you to pick up and put in as one of the many remaining pieces of the puzzle. And even after you complete the whole game, there's still going to be missing pieces. Not only does the game expect you to figure out what's going on by following the loopy breadcrumb trail it leaves behind, but it doesn't even give conclusive answers to a lot of things and leaves them up to your interpretation. If this all sounds like some pretentious artsy BS to you that wouldn't be worth the effort to get into, I understand where you're coming from. As I've said, I'm not normally the type of person that cares much for this type of storytelling myself, but Signalis was so captivating captivating even with just what was already there in front of me that I couldn't help myself from delving deeper into it. I even picked up and read every note I came across carefully, which is something that I barely ever do in games with optional text files to read. It definitely also helped that these notes were often on the shorter side and did not dump paragraphs and paragraphs of information on my face at every opportunity. Furthermore, I'd say that every single piece of detail you find is at least somewhat significant in not only understanding what's going on, but also for burying the game's bleak tone and atmosphere into even further darkness. From what I've been telling you and what you've been seeing so far, if you've been paying attention, it's probably not hard at all to guess by now that Signalis is fucking depressing. It's one of those stories that doesn't even make you get all emotional and cry at the end, but rather leaves you empty and broken, too hollow for tears to even come out. And I think nothing helps this more than the game's absolute 100% commitment to its tone, which is actually one of its biggest differences from most other survival horror games, I'd say. I can think of several series like Resident Evil, Dead Space or The Evil Within where even for their darkest entries with the most oppressive, horrifying atmospheres, there's still camp to be found in them because it's burnt into the DNAs of those series. Cheesy one-liners and big action movie style set pieces are a dime a dozen in these games, and even the Silent Hill games, which usually take themselves much more seriously, don't shy away from occasional humor with their joke endings. I am saying all of this as a positive note, of course, as you would have to be a pretty unfun person to not appreciate some good camp if you ask me, and I think that it's fair to say that a lot of survival horror fans seem to have the same perspective too, based on the discussions and fan material I see around these series. And then there's Signalis taking itself 200% seriously at every instance. Right from the get-go, it greets you with the coldest title screen possible and its most haunting tune in the background. And then it makes it clear in just its first 10 minutes that it's not here to fuck around with cheesy Bond villains and one-liners. No, you're in for some serious shit, kid. I would even call it the most serious game I have played, not only in recent memory but perhaps ever. There's not a single light-hearted or humorous line or moment in this game. That may not sound impressive since the ability to tell good jokes is what would normally be praiseworthy rather than the ability to not tell a single one. However, I see this as yet another display of the developers' ballsy commitment to their vision and admire not only their restraint but also yet another instance of their risk-taking. To elaborate on what I mean by risk-taking, as much as I love campy stuff, I have to admit that it's kind of cheating because it's essentially a safety cushion under the genuine qualities of your art that's so easy to set up. I'm not saying this because I think campy media always has bad writing or anything like that, but they can mostly get away with bad writing or anything of that nature thanks to that campiness if they have to, because the audience will still get to at least enjoy the dumb but fun bullshit that's on the screen. I love Red Alert 3's campaign so much, for instance, not because it's a good story. It's the exact opposite of that, but it's peak camp. It is such a ridiculous, poorly acted, over-the-top, nonsensical fucking mess that is wildly entertaining to grab your popcorn and just watch the insanity unravel before you while wondering what fucking stupid bullshit can they still pull after this. On the other hand, if you're going to take yourself seriously, especially as seriously as Signalis takes itself, then you have to make sure that your stuff is genuinely good. You have to make sure that you are writing a genuinely amazing story, that your art direction is stellar, and that you're basically making everything as flawless as you possibly can in all aspects. Because unlike campy shit, if it sucks, it's over. There's no so bad it's good scenario to save you, there's no charm that will earn people's sympathy, and there's no fun to be had despite the quality. It's just going to be bad, and that will forever be its legacy. So overall, this should again tell you just how much of a masterpiece Signalis is, as there would be no other way for it to be so beloved when it's this serious about itself. And to elaborate on what I meant by restraint, as someone who also creates stuff, not stuff that's as great as Signalis, but stuff nonetheless, I recognize how tempting it is to meme around when there's the opportunity. Power Brace is riddled with the results of me giving into this temptation, in fact, sometimes without even thinking twice when I really should have. Thus, I can put myself in the shoes of the developers at Rose Engine and picture myself actively fighting against the urge to put a fucking Rickroll or some other goofy shit in one of those radio frequencies for shits and giggles. I can see myself sweating while writing all of those notes for the player to pick up and trying my best to not put a single dumb joke in any of them. Hell, with how many Silent Hill references there are in this game, you would expect there to be at least a joke ending, but there isn't. And all this non-stop seriousness genuinely surprised me because of how rare it is these days. I constantly expected the game to make at least the slightest jab at humor somewhere along the way, either some quirky comment at the end of a note I was reading or a funny little detail hidden in the environment in one of the rooms, only for it to never come. In fact, every single one of these notes does the exact opposite of providing at least a small moment of happiness in between all the suffering. They instead just make everything feel even worse. Even when you come across one that begins like it's going to be about something joyful from daily life before it all went to shit, it just devolves into more depression by the end, because of course it does. Signalis' world is so brutal that the game directly calls it hell in all caps at one point, and it doesn't feel too edgy, forced or try hard, because you find it to be an actually accurate description of what's happening once you piece together enough clues. Even the status quo of this world before it all went to shit was already a cold dystopia, as you also discover very quickly from the notes and the environmental storytelling. The life of every single person whose diary you read and of every single person you meet along the way has always been hell, is hell, and is always going to be hell. That warning when you boot up the game that warns you about it being violent and cruel is not to be taken lightly. It is something you should genuinely take into consideration if you're someone that's badly affected by depressing media like this easily. After I beat the game, it took me like 3 days of listening to the OST in tears to get all the emotional damage out of my system and fully recover. I can confidently say that no game has affected me this deeply in years, ever since I finished Nier Automata. On that note, I will end this video with one last endorsement for this game using my most potent weapon. As I've said, this may not be your type of game, and that could be because of the gameplay, visual style, having to piece together the narrative yourself, the overly serious and dark tone, or something else entirely. But consider some of this game's most clear inspirations for a second, which is easy to do since it constantly makes references and homages to them. You have several cosmic horror authors, including the man himself, Lovecraft, Nier Automata, every Silent Hill game up to 4, and Neon Genesis Evangelion. And despite how many of these homages there are, none of it ever feels forced or simply there to make you point at your screen and clap. These screens, places and plot points work as integral parts of the story and even enhance its depth and presentation regardless of whether you know what they're referencing or not. I can confidently say this because I only learned about most of the Lovecraft and Silent Hill references after the fact. This is not just some hollow nostalgia bait game that rips off other works to wear their style like a mask to try and distract you from how uninspired it actually is. No, Signalis is its own work of art that can be appreciated without any preliminaries, but not only does it still wear its inspirations on its sleeve respectfully to honor them, it even reaches the same heights as them according to the fans of those works. The best Silent Hill game since Silent Hill 3. Forget about the beginning montage. Do you know how high of a praise that is from a survival horror veteran? This game is compared to a group of games that, according to a lot of people, are the best psychological horror games ever, period. It is also compared to one of the most profound, thought-provoking and soul-crushing stories in the medium that conducts a philosophical examination of existence and what it means to be alive. And it is also compared to one of the most influential animes of all time, whose themes people are still dissecting and discussing a full 28 years later. That is the level of quality that we are talking about here. A piece of media like this, let alone a game, does not come around so often. And if you're still not convinced enough to at least give it a try when Steam's refund policy is so nice as well, then whatever floats your boat, I guess. I've already shielded this game more than I do for any others, and even made sure to give as little spoilers as possible just in case any of you may change their mind in the future. I might have shown some visuals that could count as spoilers, but I don't think it should ruin things too much without me also giving the context behind them. And with all of that being said, thank you all so much for sticking until the end. This was probably a much more disorganized and all over the place review than usual. I've skipped over many things to avoid giving spoilers and spent too little time on some things while spending too long on others probably. But I just really needed to gush about this one without planning so much. Now that I've done that, I can finally move on to the next game on my backlog, which is Outer Wilds. It's another game like Signalis that I've heard so much praise for, so I'm really excited about what it has in store for me. I'll decide on whether I'm going to cover that one as well after I'm done with it and let you know. Until then, as always, take care of yourselves and thank you for watching.